The excavator was already on my property when I stepped onto the porch. Its massive bucket hovered above a row of mountain laurel less than 30 feet from a log cabin my family had owned for 4 generations, and the contractor's orange stakes ran straight through land the HOA had tried twice to buy from me. When the foreman confidently told me Silver Pines Estates had authorized clearing for its golf course expansion, I calmly told him that Silver Pines did not own the ground beneath his tracks. By sunset, a sheriff's deputy had meticulously photographed the encroachment. The excavator was parked safely back outside my boundary, and HOA President Vanessa Caldwell was busy telling residents that one stubborn homeowner had maliciously delayed a $640,000 recreation project. 6 weeks later, however, the massive golf expansion itself was completely on hold. It was not because I destroyed anything, not because I abused my government position against the HOA, and certainly not because some random agency suddenly declared my house untouchable right after the bulldozer arrived. The single, ironclad document that completely stopped them had been quietly recorded in 1984. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I was 59 years old, and the building Vanessa desperately wanted removed was a 2-room log cabin, built by my great-grandfather in 1905 on 6 pristine acres in the Virginia foothills. It was certainly not large, its porch had been repaired more times than I could count, and the roof was visibly newer than the walls, but the original hand-hewn chestnut logs were still standing strong, alongside a massive stone fireplace built directly from rock taken out of the creek behind the house. Vanessa did not see a single piece of that rich history, because all she saw were the final 5 holes of a redesigned luxury miniature golf course. Her aggressive corporate plan included an artificial creek, stone bridges, a cocktail terrace, decorative landscaping, and several newly plotted holes that violently curved right through the absolute prettiest part of my private property. On her polished architectural rendering, my historic cabin was simply gone. And at first, I genuinely thought the architect had just omitted it, because the drawing was entirely conceptual. Then I received a threatening HOA notice, explicitly describing the cabin as a dilapidated non-conforming structure that legally had to be removed within exactly 30 days. That was the chilling moment I realized they had not simply forgotten the house. They were actively planning around a future where it no longer existed. What an arrogant Vanessa absolutely did not know was that my father had made one brilliant legal decision more than 40 years earlier that no HOA vote could ever erase. He had formally recorded a historic preservation easement directly against the property, and that binding document vigorously protected far more than just the cabin. It legally protected the entire stretch of natural land surrounding it. I never once thought of the cabin as a priceless historic asset when I was a child, because to me, it was always just my grandfather's quiet house. The old porch boards were rough enough to splinter your bare feet. My grandmother constantly canned fresh peaches in the back room, and my grandfather kept old square nails in a rusted coffee tin, simply because he could never bring himself to throw away anything that had once held the house together. The kitchen door frame still carried faded pencil marks beautifully showing the growing heights of my father, my uncle, myself, and eventually my own daughter. When my father eventually inherited the property, he repaired it incredibly carefully, adding modern wiring without recklessly cutting through the old logs, and repointing the heavy stone foundation instead of cheaply replacing it with concrete blocks. He firmly believed an old building could easily survive modern life if people strictly repaired only what was necessary without brutally erasing everything that made it old in the first place. That profound philosophy directly influenced my entire career, leading me to become a dedicated preservation architect. Years later, I was formally appointed to a state historic preservation review board and eventually became its acting chair. That title certainly sounded incredibly powerful, but in reality, it came with massive layers of strict rules, heavy procedures, and massive conflicts of interest. I legally could not simply declare my own private property protected just because I wanted to, and if my cabin ever became part of a legal matter that touched state preservation review, I would explicitly have to step completely away. For most of my life, absolutely none of that actually mattered, because the rolling land around us had always been nothing but quiet pasture and deep woods. Silver Pines Estates did not even arrive until the early 2000s, right after a massive corporate developer bought all the neighboring acreage. While my father sold a narrow strip near the county road, he absolutely refused to sell the core cabin parcel, entirely forcing the massive developer to build around us. For almost 20 uninterrupted years, we had absolutely no serious trouble with the local HOA, until the day Vanessa Caldwell became president. She was polished, highly organized, and very good at aggressively convincing residents that incredibly expensive improvements instantly increased their property values. She rapidly renovated the clubhouse patio, aggressively upgraded the massive pool, heavily replaced all the landscaping, and then boldly proposed what she officially called the Silver Pines Recreation Renewal. The absolute centerpiece of her vanity project was a massively expanded luxury miniature golf course. While the very first design safely stayed entirely on HOA property, aggressive consultants soon showed the greedy board a much more dramatic layout that forcefully shifted west, directly toward my private land. That destructive version boasted better lake views, far more room for massive events, and an expensive cocktail terrace. The arrogant HOA confidently offered to buy about 2 acres strictly from me, but I flatly declined, and when their second offer came in significantly higher, I smoothly declined again. I was not playing games or secretly negotiating. I simply did not want to sell the property where my father had grown up, and where I still spent most of my weekends repairing precious little things that absolutely no commercial appraiser would ever value correctly. If you have ever inherited an old historic house, a rustic barn, a dusty workshop, or a cherished piece of family land, you probably deeply understand exactly why being told to just sell it can be the absolute most frustrating advice in the world. If you do understand that feeling, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with someone who has ever had a reckless developer or a corrupt HOA treat their beloved family property like nothing more than an empty, usable square on a corporate site plan. Exactly 3 weeks after I firmly rejected Vanessa's second purchase offer, Silver Pines completely stopped politely asking to buy my land, and instead aggressively started trying to legally prove the historic cabin absolutely had to come down. The very first threatening letter boldly called the cabin a severe exterior nuisance that was unfortunately visible directly from their public recreation area. My razor-sharp attorney, Rachel Sloan, immediately checked their governing documents and found an incredibly simple legal answer. My private parcel was absolutely never annexed into Silver Pines, meaning I was not an HOA member, because their strict architectural rules legally did not apply to my house in any way. The humiliated management company was forced to rapidly back away from their foolish aesthetic argument. Just 1 week later, their tactical legal reason changed entirely. Now the old cabin was allegedly dangerously unsafe. The desperate board attached tightly cropped photographs showing some peeling paint, a bit of moss on one roof edge, and a slightly weathered old porch railing. There was absolutely no certified engineering report, absolutely zero county orders, and completely no structural inspection. Just 3 amateur photographs. Vanessa maliciously escalated the attack by reporting the cabin directly to the county building department. And since absolutely anyone can legally report a suspected unsafe structure, I did not object to the official inspection in the slightest. County Inspector David Mercer thoroughly walked through the entire building with me, meticulously checking the heavy stone foundation, the wooden floor framing, the roof structure, the chimney, and the aging porch. He certainly found standard repairs that I already knew about. Several old porch boards needed replacement, A small section of foundation mortar required some repointing, and the wooden railing definitely needed some work. But he absolutely did not find a failing building on the verge of dangerous collapse, and simply handed me a perfectly reasonable, routine repair list. Just 2 days later, a deceitful Vanessa sent all the residents a massive update, boldly claiming the HOA was actively working directly with the county to urgently address a highly hazardous neighboring structure that was intentionally obstructing the Gulf expansion. Rachel instantly noticed the specific word obstructing, and so did I, because it proved the fake public safety complaint was now being explicitly tied directly to a private corporate project that desperately required my land. Then the aggressive construction survey finally began, and because I absolutely no longer trusted the HOA's fabricated site drawings, I immediately hired licensed surveyor Megan Price to legally re-establish my true property boundary. She expertly recovered the officially recorded iron monuments and explicitly marked the entire line with bright, highly visible stakes. Rachel ruthlessly sent the fully certified legal survey directly to Silver Pines, and for about 10 quiet days, all heavy construction miraculously stayed safely east of it. Then, one horrible morning, I heard the roaring diesel engine of the massive excavator. By the time I rushed out to reach the porch, its heavy tracks had completely violently crossed one of Megan's bright survey stakes, and several young saplings and native mountain laurel had already been illegally cut down. The defensive construction foreman quickly showed me his official grading plan, but his limit of disturbance line was entirely based on a generic landscape drawing that absolutely did not match my legally licensed boundary survey. I calmly told him there was a highly active legal boundary dispute and strictly asked him to stop all work on my private parcel immediately. To his absolute credit, he nervously called his office instead of pointlessly arguing, while I immediately called Rachel and then directly dialed the county sheriff's non-emergency number, because heavy construction equipment was now physically trespassing inside private property, even after the HOA had received explicit written survey notice. When the deputy arrived, he absolutely did not try to legally decide complex ownership from the side of a dirt road. Instead, he methodically photographed the massive machine, the crushed survey stakes, the illegally cut vegetation, and all the conflicting legal documents we each produced. The panicked contractor quickly withdrew the massive excavator until the complex title and boundary issues could be legally resolved. That very same afternoon, an enraged Vanessa blindly sent what she arrogantly called her absolute final demand, giving me exactly 30 days to entirely remove the historic cabin, threatening that if I refused, the HOA would forcefully pursue legal action and seek astronomical damages for project delay. I quietly went upstairs and opened a heavy metal document box my father had left behind, genuinely thinking I was just looking for some old construction photographs. Instead, I miraculously found a deeply folded document carrying a permanent county recording stamp from 1984, and the bold text on the very first page instantly changed the entire war. Historic Preservation Easement. That was the exact moment I truly realized Vanessa's massive legal problem was infinitely larger than a simple disputed property line. I vaguely remembered my father working heavily with a dedicated preservation group during the 1980s, briefly recalling long meetings and various old photographs. What I absolutely did not remember was exactly how legally formal the binding agreement had actually been. The powerful document was not just a cute commemorative certificate, it was an ironclad, permanently recorded easement, formally granted to a highly recognized preservation trust. Rachel immediately ordered a legally certified copy straight from the county clerk to ensure its absolute legal standing. The flawless legal language meticulously described the historic cabin, the exterior materials, the massive stone chimney, the strict building footprint, and a carefully mapped zone explicitly called the protective setting. Then came the single devastating sentence that completely changed the entire legal dispute. The historic structure and its protective setting shall not be demolished, relocated, or materially altered without prior written review and consent of the easement holder. This bulletproof easement legally ran with the land itself, meaning my father's tragic death absolutely had not ended it, and the aggressive corporate development of Silver Pines next door had not ended it either. Most importantly, the strictly mapped protected setting extended well beyond the physical cabin walls, so Megan brilliantly overlaid the 1984 easement exhibit directly onto the current boundary survey. The resulting visual map was a complete corporate disaster for the HOA. Hole 16 brazenly crossed it. Hole 17 cut right through it. Part of Hole 18 did exactly the same, and so did a massive portion of Vanessa's highly anticipated cocktail terrace. The strict preservation agreement absolutely did not mean no change could ever occur, as necessary structural repairs were always legally allowed, and other modest alterations might possibly be formally reviewed. But the arrogant HOA absolutely could not simply pretend the heavy restriction did not exist, and they certainly could not violently bulldoze right through the protected area just to build a tacky recreational expansion. Rachel then aggressively formally requested all of the HOA's internal capital project records, which rapidly produced a deeply panicked email from their very own expensive consultant. The consultant firmly warned that the existing historic cabin and its recorded preservation easement absolutely must be resolved before any final site design could be approved. Vanessa's incredibly arrogant, documented response was simply that the cabin was not part of the community, violently ordering them to move forward with the golf layout and let the legal team aggressively handle the forced removal. Then we miraculously found another damning email where a nervous board director had carefully suggested safely redesigning the course around my private property. Vanessa ruthlessly answered that once the structure is completely gone, the land rapidly becomes much easier to aggressively acquire. That one single horrific sentence instantly changed the legal character of absolutely everything that came before it. It proved the failed purchase offers, the frivolous nuisance claim, the fabricated safety complaint, and the malicious demolition ultimatum were all just calculated steps in a corrupt corporate land grab. The historic cabin was absolutely not merely an old, decaying structure that Vanessa genuinely believed needed public safety repairs. It was simply a physical obstacle standing in the way of acquiring prime land for her vanity golf course. Rachel instantly hired a licensed, completely independent structural engineer, whose massive inspection was infinitely more detailed than the county's initial visit. He certainly found standard maintenance issues, but firmly concluded that the heavy timber frame and the massive stone foundation remained perfectly safe and serviceable. The absolute most important legal sentence in his entire certified report was beautifully simple: no immediate structural condition requiring demolition. Then I flawlessly dealt with my own potential conflict of interest, because as the acting chair of a state historic preservation review board, I legally disclosed my full ownership interest long before anyone connected with the state ever reviewed anything involving the property. I formally and totally recused myself from all board discussions, staff recommendations, legal votes, and internal communication involving the Whitaker cabin. I absolutely did not call my powerful colleagues. I did not ask for dirty political favors, and I certainly did not try to magically create a brand new historic designation out of thin air. I didn't have to, because the ironclad legal protection we were heavily relying on had already been permanently recorded decades ago. Rachel aggressively contacted the powerful preservation trust that actually held the recorded easement, allowing its high-powered legal counsel to thoroughly review the certified document, the boundary survey, the recent photographs, and the incredibly arrogant Silver Pines golf plan. Their massive legal response was brutally direct. The trust had absolutely never approved a demolition, they had never approved a relocation, and they had certainly never consented to any heavy grading inside the legally protected setting. Most importantly, they made it devastatingly clear that if necessary, they were fully prepared to aggressively enforce the recorded easement in state court. Vanessa had arrogantly expected to be fighting one stubborn, tired old homeowner until he finally gave up. Now she was legally facing down a permanently recorded title record, a massive preservation trust, a fully licensed survey, a certified structural report, and her very own expensive consultants' documented written warnings. Then Rachel brilliantly found one more fatal legal problem to destroy their case. The destructive golf plan the reckless contractor had actually been using was absolutely not the same legal version the HOA had originally shown in its earlier county review. Rachel immediately requested a massive joint legal meeting with county planning, the building department, Silver Pines legal counsel, the nervous project engineer, and the powerful preservation trust attorneys. I quietly attended strictly as the private landowner, and my ironclad state board recusal was explicitly disclosed right at the beginning of the official record. Megan's certified survey came first, and because Silver Pines completely failed to produce a competing licensed boundary survey, it proved their contractor's grading plan had lazily relied on a generic landscape base map. That one massive failure permanently settled the immediate legal encroachment issue on the spot. Then the official county inspector firmly addressed the cabin issue, publicly stating he had absolutely never ordered a demolition, but had simply listed standard maintenance repairs. The deceitful HOA had been constantly describing county involvement as though high-level government officials fully supported removing the old structure, which they absolutely did not. Next came the devastating 1984 easement, as the Preservation Trust's aggressive attorney legally confirmed it was a permanently recorded property interest that flawlessly protected both the historic cabin and its strictly defined setting. There was absolutely no legal release, no sneaky amendment, and completely zero consent ever authorizing the massive golf project. Then the stern county planner brutally placed the two completely conflicting site plans side by side on the table. The legal earlier version safely stayed almost entirely within HOA property, while the highly illegal later construction version pushed significantly farther west. That arrogant later plan placed massive recreational improvements directly across my private boundary and incredibly deep into the legally protected easement area. When asked if that massive revised footprint had ever actually completed final title, grading, stormwater, and preservation review, the devastating legal answer was a resounding no. The massive room became incredibly quiet as a panicked Vanessa desperately tried to return to her fake public safety argument, loudly claiming Silver Pines had only acted because the cabin was dangerously deteriorated. Rachel simply handed out the fully certified independent engineer's report, highlighting the single sentence stating there was absolutely no immediate structural condition requiring demolition. Then, she mercilessly placed Vanessa's own printed emails right beside it, proving she was warned to resolve the easement before final design, ordered her team to illegally move forward and let legal handle the removal, and confessed that once the structure is completely gone, the land rapidly becomes easier to acquire. Absolutely nobody in that room needed Rachel to explain the malicious, illegal sequence of events. While the shocked county officials did not instantly arrest Vanessa, and nobody declared some dramatic federal crime, what actually happened was far more practical and infinitely more financially damaging to the corrupt project. The entire revised golf expansion was instantly placed on an indefinite legal hold until Silver Pines could fully submit a completely compliant site plan. The county strictly ordered absolutely no construction on my private parcel, zero grading based on the legally disputed boundary, and absolutely no disturbance whatsoever inside the protected areas without heavy required review. The powerful Preservation Trust completely separately sent a brutal formal notice, actively reserving its massive legal enforcement rights. Meanwhile, Rachel ruthlessly demanded total physical restoration for all the native vegetation illegally cut on my property, along with full financial reimbursement for the expensive survey and professional costs explicitly caused by their blatant encroachment. Silver Pines was instantly forced to officially notify its massive corporate insurer, meaning the entire disastrous project file, the arrogant emails, the ignored consultant warnings, and the reckless board decisions were now being aggressively reviewed by people deeply concerned about massive coverage and legal liability. Vanessa had arrogantly believed the historic easement was just a minor technical problem she could easily bulldoze over, but it had rapidly mutated into a catastrophic financial one. At a highly chaotic special HOA meeting, a desperate Vanessa falsely accused me in front of everyone of maliciously using my government position to unfairly stop a private community project. Rachel silently stepped up and projected my time-stamped recusal letter right onto the massive screen, flawlessly proving it had been legally filed long before any independent preservation review ever took place. Then the imposing trust representative calmly explained to the furious crowd exactly where their massive legal authority truly came from. A permanently recorded deed from 1984. It was not my government job, it was not my dirty political influence, and it was absolutely not a sneaky new historical designation, because the ironclad easement was actually decades older than Silver Pines Estates itself. That was the exact turning point when the outraged residents completely stopped asking what unfair power I had, and violently started asking exactly why their reckless board had maliciously ignored a vital legal document that already permanently existed. The financial fallout was absolute carnage, as the furious contractor instantly submitted a massive delay claim, and the golf course designer heavily billed them for a total redesign. Expensive custom pieces for several holes had already been completely ordered, and a massive financial deposit for the ruined cocktail pavilion rapidly became totally non-refundable. The terrified insurer aggressively demanded to know exactly when the reckless board first learned about the restrictive easement, and exactly why heavy construction work illegally continued right after their own consultant raised the massive issue. Silver Pines ultimately had exactly one realistic, incredibly expensive path left to take: a total legal redesign. The strict county explicitly required the entire new layout to permanently remain strictly on land the HOA could actually legally use. Heavily updated grading and complex stormwater review were completely necessary because the massive footprint had drastically changed, while the Preservation Trust aggressively reviewed all work near the protected setting. Despite the wild neighborhood rumors, absolutely nobody turned my private property into a public museum, and I firmly remained the sole owner. The powerful easement simply continued, legally limiting certain destructive changes, exactly as it had flawlessly done since 1984. The luxury golf project technically survived, but it massively and humiliatingly shrank. Hole 14 had to awkwardly turn sharply east, the beautiful decorative creek became drastically shorter, and two massive holes were embarrassingly combined into one. The highly anticipated cocktail terrace was forcefully moved entirely uphill onto legitimate HOA property, meaning the spectacular, sweeping layout Vanessa had arrogantly sold to the residents completely disappeared into thin air. Meanwhile, I methodically completed every single routine repair formally listed by the county inspector, installing new sturdy porch boards, thoroughly repointing the old stone mortar, and completely repairing the wooden railing. He happily returned, thoroughly inspected the high-quality work, and instantly closed the active safety matter for good. That final legal sign-off completely removed the absolute last legitimate argument that my historic cabin somehow required a forced government demolition. Rachel ruthlessly negotiated the final property claim, forcing a humiliated Silver Pines to fully pay for mature native replacement plantings exactly where its reckless contractor had illegally crossed my line. The defeated HOA entirely reimbursed my massive survey costs, the expensive structural engineering report, my private preservation consultant expenses, and a highly substantial portion of my massive attorney fees. The permanent legal project boundary was finally officially corrected, and the grading contractor smartly avoided taking most of the legal blame because its meticulous records flawlessly showed it had actually asked the board for strict boundary clarification long before beginning construction. However, the absolute biggest problem remained the corrupt board's malicious decision-making, and furious residents eventually legally obtained the entire unredacted capital project file. At the highly explosive annual meeting, a terrified treasurer nervously presented the staggering new total costs. The financial damage included the entirely wasted original design fees, the massive forced redesign, the brutal contractor delay claims, explosive professional fees, astronomical legal expenses, completely lost deposits, heavy environmental restoration, and a massive corporate insurance deductible. A luxury recreation project that had been confidently presented as a tightly controlled $640,000 upgrade now painfully carried hundreds of thousands of dollars in totally unnecessary additional expense and brutal legal exposure. Then, an enraged resident finally stood up and loudly asked the exact question Vanessa had desperately never answered. Why did the reckless board not simply redesign the course immediately after I flatly refused to sell my land? A sweating Vanessa weakly stammered that they honestly believed the old cabin issue could be easily resolved, prompting a highly suspicious resident to sharply ask exactly what the word resolved was supposed to mean. The disgusted board secretary leaned into her microphone and simply read Vanessa's damning email aloud. Once the structure is completely gone, the land rapidly becomes much easier to aggressively acquire. That one single horrifying sentence instantly ended the entire argument, proving the board had actively plotted a malicious corporate land grab against a private homeowner. Two disgusted directors immediately and publicly withdrew all their support from Vanessa. A furious recall petition fiercely started that very same night, and a completely humiliated Vanessa was forced to resign in total disgrace before the final vote was even cast. The extremely cautious replacement board instantly adopted a strict new capital project rule to permanently stop this from ever happening again. Before any future project could ever rely on neighboring land, it strictly required a fully licensed boundary survey, a comprehensive title review, and the ironclad written identification of absolutely all recorded easements, preservation restrictions, access rights, and other legal property interests. It cost absolutely nothing to simply write that basic legal policy down, but arrogantly ignoring those exact vital steps had just cost Silver Pines an absolute fortune. The awkwardly redesigned golf course finally officially opened the following summer, and I could clearly hear the entire loud celebration right from my shaded historic porch. There was loud music, the sound of children happily laughing, and a cheap microphone annoyingly echoing all the way from the massive clubhouse. I absolutely did not go to the opening, because I was busy staying peacefully at home, meticulously repairing a rusty old hinge on one of the historic window shutters. A few days later, I quietly walked to the very edge of my restored property line to take a look. The new final holes now awkwardly but safely curved entirely away from the historic cabin, while the noisy cocktail terrace sat firmly inside legitimate HOA land. A heavily planted landscaped buffer flawlessly separated the entire sprawling golf course directly from the legally protected setting. From the very last green, curious players could still easily see the rustic cabin roof peeking peacefully through the ancient oak trees. In the end, absolutely nobody lost their fancy recreation project, and I certainly did not lose my cherished family's house. That was always the incredibly obvious and entirely reasonable solution from the very beginning. It just legally required an arrogant Silver Pines to actually build on the land it legally controlled. People later frequently asked whether my powerful historic preservation position officially saved the old cabin, and the answer is an absolute no. My vast professional experience certainly helped me instantly recognize the massive legal importance of the county records, and it also explicitly told me the exact moment I legally had to remove myself completely from the official state process. Megan's certified survey flawlessly established the absolute legal boundary, while the official county inspection completely defeated the fabricated demolition story. The licensed structural engineer thoroughly documented the cabin's perfectly safe condition, and Vanessa's own arrogant internal emails exposed exactly why the corrupt board had kept illegally pushing. But most importantly, the 1984 preservation easement strictly protected a beautiful piece of natural land that somebody had thought carefully enough about, decades before the greedy HOA ever even existed. That brilliant ironclad document spent more than 40 quiet years doing absolutely nothing in the dusty county archives, right up until the exact day it truly mattered. If an arrogant HOA, a greedy developer, a reckless contractor, or an entitled neighbor ever blindly tells you an old historic property right no longer legally matters simply because their massive corporate project is newer, aggressively ask them to put that foolish assumption directly against the permanently recorded county documents. Always aggressively keep your property deeds, hold on to old certified surveys, fiercely protect recorded easements, save your strict government approvals, and carefully keep all the boring legal paperwork that previous smart generations were wise enough to save for you. If you think Silver Pines completely crossed the legal line when a simple rejected purchase offer violently turned into a malicious corporate demolition campaign, tell me your thoughts down in the comments. Share this incredible story with anyone who proudly owns an old historic house, a rustic barn, cherished family property, or quiet land sitting right beside a massive new corporate development. Save this video as a permanent reminder to aggressively check the official county records before ever blindly accepting someone else's incredibly flawed version of your own private property rights. And absolutely subscribe for more amazing stories where ironclad patience and flawless legal documentation always turn out to be infinitely stronger than the absolute most expensive corporate plan in the room. They arrogantly thought a 120-year-old cabin was simply standing right in the way of their shiny new miniature golf course. The 1984 deed flawlessly proved their expensive golf course was actually standing directly in the way of an ironclad legal right that had already been permanently recorded. And after completely bleeding a massive fortune in useless legal fees and forced redesigns, an utterly humiliated Silver Pines finally had to do exactly what it should have done right from the very beginning: legally back down and build around it.